welcome back to History of Christianity. Last time we looked at the golden age of the church and scholasticism, and today we are going to be looking at the collapse of the church. The church basically reached a point in its life and its corruption where enough was enough, and it just kind of imploded on itself, and there was a beginning call for some reforms to be taking place. One of the main issues that took place during the collapse is called the Great Schism, where we have basically the powers in Europe rebelling against the Pope, and what happened was there ended up basically being a couple of popes at one time, and it just did not work out well at all for the church, and the church basically collapsed to where we get into some pre-Reformation ideas when you think of John Huss or Wycliffe. So stay tuned for the PowerPoint on the collapse and the Great Schism. Okay, class, we're going to move into the PowerPoint portion of this lecture on the collapse of the church and the Great Schism. Introduction. After the power of the 13th century, the church faced a time of serious decline and finally a collapse. The effects on the church were nationalism, war and invasion, plague, and corruption, which was always underlying. Okay, so nationalism. There was the rise of the bourgeois class, which the bourgeois class is a wealthy class, not necessarily nobility. Sometimes they would marry into the nobility, but it could be very wealthy families that gain their wealth through by being merchants or some other occupation like that, and they were able to rise in wealth, and basically they looked like nobility, but they weren't of the noble family unless they married into it. So the rise of the bourgeois class clashed with the feudal lords, and what happens is the bourgeois class, they side actually with the kings against the lords. And so even though we've been talking about England and we've been talking about France and Italy and all of that, you don't think of that there was strong nationalism up until during this entire time of the Middle Ages. Remember these people, they did not travel around. I mean, these people could be born, raised, and die all within the same little village, and so there was more loyalty given to like the lord of the manor or to the count of the county than actually to the king. They never saw the king, but they might see the lord of the manor. So the feudal lord had a lot of power. But what happens is the bourgeois class, they're able to raise themselves up in there with their wealth and all of that. Nations begin to develop because the monarchies are having support from other entities other than, let's say, the feudal lord or the military. There's other people now starting to support the king. And so these strong monarchies begin to develop. And citizens who used to identify themselves with a city or with a kingdom, now they're identifying themselves as a citizen of a place, such as I'm a citizen of France or I'm a citizen of England. We can't really talk about Germany yet because the Germanic states are just all fractured. Or Italy, they had also Italian states, but there was Italy. But they began to identify themselves with a nation. Now, what happens is, in regards to the church, is that this undermines the papal claim of universal authority. So the Pope, who is all-powerful now after the Golden Age, he's sitting there saying, I have authority over all of you. But nations might not, now that they are having this like nationalism, they might not be thinking, oh, well, the Pope is over us. So what happens is if the Pope sided with a nation on an issue, the rival nation began to disobey the Pope, which before that was almost like unheard of without serious consequences. And what happens is over time, France becomes known as electing separate popes if they disagreed with the sitting pope. Okay, so under this nationalistic idea, France, and it takes place in Avignon, France, which we'll get to in a little bit. But France, they began to elect their own pope. So again, this is like almost unheard of where now a nation is saying we're going to have our own pope. So another note must be said here. Constantinople fell to the Muslims on May 29th of 1453, which ended Constantine's dream of a Christian empire based out of the city of Constantine. So that's just a little side note because of where we are in the timeline of church history. Okay, so that was nationalism and the threat to the Pope on that. Now we have the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1475, which is more than 100 years, but the 100 Years' War. And this was separate wars between France and England, but there wasn't a lot of time between these wars, and it's all pretty much for the same reason, so it's just kind of sandwiched together for the 100 Years' War. England invaded France, and this is where, and that's going to be the back and forth during the 100 Years' War, which we're not getting into the military part of this for this PowerPoint. But one thing is that we got to talk about is Joan of Arc. She led the breaking of the siege of Orleans. And so you see a picture there of Joan of Arc on the right. Well, she was captured, and the English sold her for 10,000 francs to a bishop to be tried as a heretic because she said that she had a vision and she was dressing like a man, and so she's tried as a heretic and she's ends up being burned alive. So that's Joan of Arc in the 100 Years' War. Well, why is this important? The English, during the 100 Years' War, the English looked at the papacy as the enemy, and so it's not too long until the Reformation. Henry VIII had a serious issue with the Pope with his marriage. So, before you would never look at the people would not look at the Pope as the enemy. I mean, he was like the head of the church, the top guy. And now the English, they look at the papacy as just their enemy because of the 100 Years' War and what took place there. Okay, the Great Plague of 1347. We don't have a lot of time to go into great detail of the plague, but trade from the east brought rats on ships, the rats brought fleas, and the fleas brought the Black Death. That's basically how it came to Europe. It's a sickness or a disease that is from a flea bite. 1/3 of Europe's population died of the plague. So the massive death and massive impact on Europe. Caused economic disruption and political upheaval because this was not a long, drawn-out illness where someone gets sick and they're just like sick for a long, long time and then they die. These people, they get the plague and within 2 days they're dead. So you can just imagine the economic disruption and the political upheaval where people that were in political positions, they're dead. So who takes their place? Or the baker in the village, he dies. So who bakes the bread? Or the lord of the manor gets sick and dies, so his son takes over. What happens if his son is a young child? So then there's enemies that want to come in and take that land, and so it just caused all kinds of problems in the land. And it also caused many people to put faith in superstitions. Now there was superstition before, but this just went crazy after the plague. Basically to try to appease God or to do all kinds of different things, even spells and just different activities to try to get rid of the plague through superstitious activity. Relics increased for healings. Previously they would go on a pilgrimage to a place where a relic was to pray or to maybe even have a healing, but then relics popped up everywhere for people to go and be healed, but they weren't healed. All varieties of pilgrimages were going on to the holy sites, which again did not help with the plague, because one thing that they did was they didn't know where the plague came from. They thought it was in the air, or they thought it was in the water, but they weren't sure where the plague came from. And so when a bunch of people die in a village, well, especially a village where you have a lot of people who are serfs and they're poor. You don't want to throw the people's clothes away. And so they would take all the clothes and they would take it to the market and they would sell the clothes. Well, the problem was that the clothing had fleas in them. And the people would go and buy the clothes that had fleas in them, put them on, and then go on a pilgrimage. and they would take the fleas with them, and they would die of the plague and take the plague with them. And so just a cool little side note, if you want to say it's cool, a cool little side note is that's where we get our term flea market. So if you go to a flea market to buy clothing or to buy furniture or whatever at a flea market, that's where we get the name from, was because of the Black Death, because people went to the market and bought clothing that was infested with fleas. Also, Christians blamed and attacked the Jews who did not suffer as bad from the plague. Now, Jews lived in their own communities, and sometimes it was in cities, and what happened was that the Christians noticed that not a lot of Jews were dying of the plague, and it must be made note that many Jewish communities had lots of cats, and therefore less rats. But the Jewish community didn't suffer as bad from the plague, and the Christians blamed the Jews, and the Christians' favorite explanation was that the Jews were poisoning the Christian wells, and that the Christians drank poisoned water. So just a lot of stuff going on with the Great Plague, but it just caused a major issue in Europe for the population. It disrupted the population in unprecedented levels. There's a picture there of a plague doctor who would come in. He's got his gloves on and his robe, and bound all the way up. And then this beak was used for. They would stuff flowers in there. They make this look like a bird, but usually it was just kind of like a cone on the front of their mask, and they would stuff flowers in there to make the air smell nice for the doctor, because they thought the sickness was in the air, and if the air smelled nice, then there was no sickness in it. Okay, so the Great Schism, the low point. Now, the church has already split east and west. That's already split. That happened in 1054 AD. This here is called the Great Schism, and the Great Schism happens within Europe, okay? Within Europe. So don't think Great Schism is the East and West Church. Okay, that's already taken place. We are now within Europe itself. During the 100 Years' War, the papacy was at its lowest. So the Golden Age was at its highest. Well, now during this war, it's at its lowest. And the time period became known as the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And that's kind of interesting, because Martin Luther, during the Reformation, he wrote a book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. But that's what this time period is known for. At times, there were popes in Rome, and popes were set up in Avignon, France. At times, there was no pope in Rome at all, and only in France. There was vast political corruption going on. There was rampant simony, which means ecclesiastical offices were sold. Okay, so simony is where someone sells a church office. Like a wealthy person wants their son to be in the ministry, and there's an empty priest position or an empty bishop position, and so that wealthy dad pays lots of money so that their son can go be in that bishop position. That's called simony. There was also nepotism. And nepotism is where ecclesiastical offices were appointed to family members. So if your uncle is a bishop and you want to have a position, he can appoint you to be a clergy member in his jurisdiction. Well, then you can be appointed to be a bishop, or excuse me, a priest. And what happens is bishops would actually begin to strategize how to do these different things to get their family members into different positions to have more power over a certain area. So nepotism. And then also absenteeism. Absenteeism is where bishops, they were living in luxury in the cities. They were living in luxury in palaces when their diocese or their parish was in turmoil. It was suffering. The people were poor. The people were starving. There was corruption. There was, it just was not good. Maybe their priests were not even doing mass, and the bishops were off living somewhere else in luxury. So there was a lot of problems going on, and many people started to look at this and be like, "This is not right," and they were calling for some kind of reform. So the church was really reaching its low point. Okay, the schism. We have to walk through this story. It's kind of a detailed story, so I'm going to walk through this PowerPoint with you here about the story of the schism. So Pope Gregory the 11th took the papacy back to Rome, but corruption was rampant. And it was so bad in Rome that Gregory the 11th said that he was going to go back to France, to Avignon, and take the papacy back to there. But all of a sudden, like it happens in history, he dies and the papacy is now vacant. So what do? Well, the people feared the next pope would return to France, or there would be a French pope picked instead of Italian. And so, like many good church people, they go and they have a riot, and a riot ensued. Now, the church officials, under threat from the mob, did not dare pick a French pope. They were like, this mob is going to kill us. We don't want to pick a French pope. We want to make them happy, so they'll be Italian. So, Italian Pope Urban VI was made pope. Now, Urban VI was not a level-headed guy. And he declared that any of his bishops who were absent from their diocese were not even Christians. And so that's not going to make the bishops very happy, because that means that they have to give up their life of luxury. And he decides that he was going to appoint a huge number of Italian cardinals. Now, this caused great fear for the French cardinals. He also, so Urban VI, who's the Pope, he begins appointing family members into ecclesiastical positions, which, like I said, is called nepotism. So he's committing nepotism. And so some people, they even went as far to say that he was mad, he went crazy. So again, this is the vicar of Christ on earth, the head of the church, and they're saying that he's crazy. So opposition grows. Many Italian bishops and cardinals, they actually joined with the French cardinals and bishops who were already in opposition of the Italian pope. So the bishops and cardinals come together and they're in opposition of the pope. And so they elect a second pope in Avignon, France, called Clement VII. Okay? So we have two popes now, one in Rome and one in France. Now what's interesting, or what's important to know, is right here where my little arrow is, this is the first time that two popes were elected by the same group of cardinals. So the group that elected the pope in Rome also elected the pope in France. And so it's the first time that's ever taken place. Clement VII's forces go and attack Rome, but they were rebuffed. Okay, so again, the Pope has power over military, and they attack Rome. European kingdoms and nations draw sides backing their preferred Pope. So now we have a split in Europe, and the military and kingdoms are backing their preferred Pope. For more support, and for more money to be raised, numerous ecclesiastical positions were created and then sold, which is simony. So now lots of money is coming in for the different sides because they need money for the war, they need money for the military, they need money, so they end up selling created positions. So you can see that this is just going downhill really quick. In 1394, theologians from the University of Paris, they outlined 3 ways to try to heal this schism. Number 1, both popes resign and we elect one new one. Number 2, negotiate a solution. Or number 3, appoint a general council. So what happens? When Clement VII died, the cardinals were asked not to elect a new pope in Avignon. But the schism was unfortunately too far along. They refused, and they end up electing Benedict XIII. So we still have 2 popes. After numerous political maneuvers, everybody was really getting tired of this issue. And so in 1407, Benedict XIII and the now Roman Pope Gregory XII, they meet, and they were going to try to solve this. But there were no negotiations, and neither of these popes would budge. And so in 1409, a great council is called in Pisa, which is in Italy. Each pope scrambles to hold their own council before the Council of Pisa. And that is they try to have their own councils to establish their legitimacy. But both of these popes, they fail. They failed in their councils, and so Pisa is going to move forward. In Pisa, the attempt to set legitimacy of each of these popes is just pushed aside. They're done with it. They just push those popes to the side, and the council declared both popes unworthy, and the council elects Alexander V as pope. So there's a new pope. Now, the previous two refused to give up, and so that means there is now 3 popes. Okay, you have one in France, you have one in Rome, and now you have this third pope, Alexander V, who's now the third pope. Alexander soon dies, and John the 23rd is elected to take his place in the trio. So now we have 3 popes vying for power in Europe. Again, it's just like the snowball is just flying down the hill and growing. So finally, the Council of Constance is called in 1414. And this is what happens. John the 23rd fled after the council because the council confronted him for his lifestyle. He wasn't a good pope. Didn't have a good lifestyle, and so he ends up taking off. Gregory the 12th resigns with the understanding that the other pope would resign. Well, that didn't happen. Benedict the 13th, he refuses to resign, and so he's forced into a castle, claiming still to be a pope, but he ends up dying soon afterward, and anyway, no one really paid attention to Benedict the 13th anymore. Gregory the 12th resigned, and John the 23rd, he fled. So the council elects a new pope, Martin V, as the single pope. Okay, so there he is on the right, Pope Martin V, and you can actually see on this picture, it even says collapse. It says right there, schism. So he's the one that is elected after all of this. So there he is. He's the new pope now. All the rest of them are gone. And what happens is this schism, which is called the Great Schism, it proves that the Catholic Church was in need of serious and complete reformation. And so that's where we start thinking of this pre-Reformation ideas of John Huss or of Wycliffe. Okay, so those guys were involved in Reformation before the actual Reformation. But the schism set the stage and just shows that the church is in need of reformation. Okay, here's a picture here of the Council of Constance. And that's it. Collapse and the Great Schism. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for today's lesson. Next time, we're going to be looking at pre-Reformation ideas. And what I mean by pre-Reformation ideas is the Reformation is going to take place in the 16th century. But before the Reformation takes place, there is a lot of talk and thought and even some leadership going on in the church to try to reform it, to try to get things back the way it should be going. So we'll be looking at pre-Reformation activity, and then also we'll be looking at the idea of humanism. See you next time.